Our next guest is Colonel Roland Guidry, Air Force retired. Colonel Roland Guidry's 26-year career was equally divided between flying highly modified models of the C-130 aircraft and managing special operations, operational test, and evaluation projects. He piloted the C-130D ski model in Alaska and Greenland, the DC-130 reconnaissance drone mothership in Southeast Asia, and the MC-130 combat talent unconventional warfare version. The most significant OT&E project he managed was the development of the combat rubber raiding craft with SEAL Team 2 in the mid-70s. During the Southeast Asia conflict, he commanded a DC-130 aircrew on multiple Buffalo Hunter missions, launching photo recon drones into North Vietnam, gathering intelligence for the Sante raid. During Operation Eagle Claw, the Iran hostage rescue mission, he served as commander of the 8th Special Ops Squadron and was one of the pilots on the lead MC-130. He was a founding member of JSOC at Fort Bragg as the first chief of air operations and later as JSOC's second Air Force component commander, and as such served as air component commander for the training and rehearsals leading up to Urgent Fury, the rescue of American medical students on the island of Grenada. He returned to OT&E at Hurlburt in 1983 to form the Special Missions Operational Test and Evaluation Center, forerunner of the 18th Flight Test Squadron. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a true warrior in Air Commando, Colonel Roland Guidry.
Thank you. What I'm going to talk to you today is about probably the most audacious, difficult, complicated rescue mission ever attempted. It has been labeled a fiasco, a failure, a disaster. But guess what? It was the spark that created the mindset that we needed to build up special ops to bring it to where we are today. You're going to see this quite often during my presentation. That's a painting that's in the Pentagon. I use it as a segue between segments of my presentation. The first Special Operations Wing, of course, was at Hurlburt. What basically happened is the war ended in Vietnam in 1975. And anything that had the label special got decimated. All the emphasis, money for things like special ops dried up because there was a very negative feeling about the military after the Vietnam War. And that really greatly affected Hurlburt. So we had all these special operators that went to other jobs, so we had very little capability. Also happening about that time was the situation in Iran. The Shah of Iran was put in power during the Eisenhower era and turned out to be a very autocratic dictator, and there was a growing sentiment in Iran to get rid of the Shah of Iran. A fundamentalist Islamic upheaval was coming forward. The Shah got sick in 1978 with cancer, and the only place to get him medical attention was the United States. So when the Shah went to the United States for medical help, the Ayatollah Khomeini came in from exile in Paris, and that's when the trouble started in Iran. They demanded the Shah be returned. The U.S. would not do it, so they took their wrath out on the U.S. Embassy. There were about 66 people in the embassy when it was taken over. On the 4th of November 1979, 13 were released eventually, and there ended up with about 52 people in the embassy when it was taken over, the 4th of November 1979. The actual rescue mission that I'm talking about did not occur until April of 80, 5.5 months later. But that was the best possible laboratory where a permissive environment was created in the military to go out and try new tactics to get this possible rescue mission going. So there was a 5.5 month period between the embassy falling and when we tried to go in April. Again, there were two targets. There was the actual embassy in downtown Tehran, surrounded by 4 million fanatics. You can see the soccer stadium here that played a big part. Here was the chancellery where they turned out to be held. 27 acres, 14 buildings. This is what the embassy looked like. That's the outline. Notice the Iranians were smart enough to block a possible helicopter landing area in this area by putting vehicles. As it turned out, the soccer stadium across the street had an entry that lined up pretty well with the gap in the buildings to where that could be used to have helicopters come in to take everybody out. But that was one of the targets. The other target turned out to be the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. On the day the embassy fell, Bruce Langdon, the ambassador, and 2 others happened to be at a meeting at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So there happened to be 2 targets in Iran to hit 1.4 miles apart, and obviously needed to be attacked simultaneously, which complicated the mission. This is what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs looked like, a very formidable building. This is what it looked like from the air, but notice at least some of the rooftops were flat, which could perhaps accommodate a helicopter landing. Jimmy Carter was the president. He was torn between a Secretary of State that was a dove, Cyrus Vance, on his right, and a hawk, Zbigniew Brzezinski, on his left. So he had a national security advisor that wanted military action right away, and a Secretary of State that said, no, let's try diplomacy. So Carter was also in trouble about that time with his presidency. Ronald Reagan was becoming a force as far as a Republican candidate. So Carter looked at all the options available to him, from doing nothing to a punitive strike in Iran. And his advisor said, well, the only thing that can probably salvage your presidency and get a second term would be a rescue mission that succeeded. So a successful rescue mission was probably the only way to solve or to salvage his presidency. So that affected his decision making. So what happened? A joint task force was organized in the Pentagon as such. National Command Authorities, JCS, down to joint task force under the command of an Army 2-star general. Now notice there is no SYNC, no unified commander in the loop. So that sort of elevated the JCS chairman as a combatant command SYNC. A decision was made to go with an ad hoc task force because the situation was changing so rapidly in Iran, from those who wanted a punitive option to where the hostages. So it was so fluid that the decision was made not to give this mission to a unified command, PACOM, PACAF, or whatever, and to form an ad hoc joint task force in the bowels of the Pentagon. This is what our commander looks like now, General Vaught. Tough old guy, tougher than woodpecker's lips. He was the actual Joint Task Force commander. Why was he selected? Primarily because he was already in the Pentagon, and they just took the offices of J3 SOD, Special Ops Division in the Pentagon, expanded them, and that's where all the planning occurred, sort of like General Manner said for the Sante raid. So he was our Joint Task Force commander. This is the organization of the Joint Task Force. Notice you had Air Force forces, Navy forces, you had aviation assets under the Air Force, and you had aviation assets under the Navy. Never the two shall meet under a single air component commander. Big problem. Okay? So, when they dusted off the old Sante raid after action report, they came up with some constraints to give to the task force as to how to organize it. Train and equip the task force. Move it clandestinely halfway around the world, the last 1,000 miles in Iran. Breach the embassy, 52 hostages. Do the same thing for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 3 more. Return them without harm. Don't hurt any civilians, Iranian or otherwise. This is the one that the commander of the Delta Force had a problem with. Don't hurt any Iranians. Do not permit the Iranian forces to be aware or react to your presence. You cannot depend on any country for help. You must invent new equipment, tactics, and procedures that do not currently exist. You must always be ready. In case they put them against the wall and start shooting them, we go on with whatever we have at the time. The entire program must be kept secret. There will be no dedicated program fund site. You must beg, borrow, and steal whatever assets you need for this mission. There will be no war or other military action to conceal the movement of mission aircraft. We're at peacetime. There were not military airplanes moving around like Vietnam or whatever. So to move this force to that part of the world would have been very difficult to keep it undetected. That was one of our biggest constraints. And finally, service points of contact cannot be contacted. The entire operation must be conducted, notice, in total darkness, radio silent, and minimal electronic emissions. No search and rescue force to rescue you if you go down in Iran. So you're stuck if you go down. If the mission succeeds, the media attention will be focused on the freed hostages, and the military forces involved will be required to remain anonymous and resume their current role as quiet professionals. Those were the constraints. Okay, here is the embassy. The biggest problem was where in the compound are the hostages? A force like the Delta Force needs to have very good intelligence as to whether they're in one building, which floor, which rooms, which way the doorknobs turn, etc., etc. Unfortunately, under the Carter administration, the CIA chief, Stanfield Turner, who happened to be a classmate of Carter's at the Naval Academy, had taken all the human operatives out of Iran. So there was no human at all. So therefore, everything that the Delta Force needed to plan their assault had to be done by other means. So that's what the compound looked like. The Chancellery was where the intelligence community said they were, and the intelligence community was correct. However, Colonel Beckwith, the commander of the Delta Force, realizing it was not based on human intelligence, was very skeptical as to the accuracy. So therefore, he made the Delta Force expand from 70 to 120, and then a separate force was going to take care of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And that had a ripple effect, which I'll talk about a little later. The intelligence, believe it or not, for the Delta Force, most of it came from the evening news. Psychologists for the Delta Force would look at the guards, their posture, their demeanor, how they held their weapons, what were their weapons, how alert they looked. So a lot of the intelligence came from that source, watching the evening news. Walter Cronkite used to stop his CBS evening news by indicating the 350 a day of the hostages being held, the 360 a day, etc. So a lot of the intelligence for the Delta Force came from that source. Colonel Beckwith got fed up with it. No human intelligence. So he recruited a guy named Dick Meadows. If ever you've been to Fort Bragg, there is a statue erected of Dick Meadows, probably the most legendary Special Forces guy ever. He was retired in Northwest Florida, close to Eglin. Colonel Beckwith brought him back in, sent him to the CIA, CIA told him how to dress, what to put in his pockets, what to put in his briefcase, and he went right through the international airport in Tehran, undetected. The Canadians cooperated by sending him money and radios, and then some GIs of Iranian extraction that spoke Farsi were recruited to join him. They went to the Sheraton, set up operation. They bought a warehouse. They bought trucks, vehicles, and were ready for the Delta Force when it arrived. So Colonel Beckwith took matters into his own hands. Okay, initial planning, concept, and mission factors. The problem was, where do you launch such a rescue mission? There were no forces, no bases anywhere close that we could launch that were within reason. Turkey said, no, you can't launch from our area because we get all our petroleum products from Iran. And the next day after a rescue mission comes from Turkey, the spigot gets cut off. They looked at airdropping into the Caspian Sea, too dangerous. So the problem was nobody anywhere was close enough to help us. Now the distance, let me show you, from right here, where you could perhaps put a carrier, to Tehran was 1,100 miles. Helicopters would have to be used. Helicopters don't fly very fast. So those were the constraints. Diego Garcia was a possibility, and it was used for the tankers, but it was so far away, 3,000 miles, that you couldn't use it for the actual hit on the embassy. Okay, so after all these constraints and the forces and the planners got together, they came up with a concept. The concept would be based on helicopters and the amount of nighttime, and therefore it turned out to be a concept of a 2-night mission. Night 1 would require, somehow we knew that there was a gap in the radar between Chabahar and Jask. So probably the force would come in from the south. That would probably be a ground refueling somewhere here, or possibly we could seize an airfield, which we rehearsed, Nain, and there would be a ground refueling here between fixed-wing airplanes bringing in the fuel and bringing in the Delta Force, helicopters rendezvousing with them on the ground, getting refuel, transfer the Delta Force from the C-130s or whatever to the helicopters, and then everybody that's going forward for night 2 gets to a hide site before the sun comes up and the fixed-wing airplanes depart. And then, throughout the next day, NSA and all the powers to be monitored to see whether night 1 was discovered. If we're still okay, night 2 proceeds, which is the trucks would meet the Delta Force somehow, take them surreptitiously after dark into Tehran, do the hit, and the same guys who brought in the fuel the night before and the Delta Force would then seize an airfield called Mansouriya. And then the helicopters would somehow, using the soccer stadium probably, get all the Delta Force and the hostages to Mansouriya, which we would have seized by that time, transload, abandon the helicopters, and the fixed wing take everybody out of Dodge on night 2 before the sun comes up. So that's the concept they came up with. Now let's see if with the wherewithal to do this was find a refueling site in the desert. The planners to be looked at aerial photography from years past in Iran and said, now, where do we have an area so remote, and where do we have an area that is stable? In other words, looking at photography from years past, if there's not much change to the topography, then probably it's stable enough to support the weight of C-130s. Any C-130 drivers in here? You know that the max gross weight's 155,000 pounds. These airplanes that night were going to operate at over 190,000 pounds, 35,000 pounds overgrossed. So you have to have a foundation soil that will support airplanes that overgrossed. So they came up with an area, they named it Desert 1, it's right here, that had the required location, remote, possibly load-bearing was okay, but here was the important thing. It had to be far enough north so that the helicopters topped off could then make it to Tehran and to the airfield to be seized. But it could not be so far north that if the fuel didn't get there, the helicopters could not return to the carrier. So that made the scope of search into an area about this size, and they selected Desert 1. This is what it looked like from the air. There happened to be an old dirt road going through it for the same reason that we were looking for a place with solid soil. For the same reason that the road went right through the dry lake bed, that same reason was where the most compacted soil might be. So we had a plan. If we went into Desert 1 and anybody came along, they would be guests of the United States government for about 24 hours. We would capture them, put them in the C-130s, take them back to the airfield we took off from. On night 2, we'd deposit them at a different location in Iran. So we had a plan as to what to do if anybody came by. We almost implemented that. Okay? This is what the soil looked like there. The airfield to be seized, Mansouriya, was a great airfield, but it was too close to Tehran to use on night 1. They would have detected us. So on night 2, for the transload operation, we would have used Mansouriya. It turned out to be that's where the Shah had his air power demonstration, so it was a very good airfield for that purpose. It was about 35 miles southwest of Tehran. Okay, the next thing we talk about is the task force military units and their hardware. The Delta Force. Coincidentally, the Delta Force was given the final blessing that they were the Army's counterterrorist force on the same day the embassy fell, the 4th of November, 1979. It was formed by a very dynamic individual, Charlie Beckwith, termed Charging Charlie. He had been on an assignment with the 22nd SAS prior and had learned how the British deals with counterterrorism, came back and convinced the Army powers to form a dedicated counterterrorist force, although the Army at that time abhorred anything that had the word elite or special. He convinced them to form the Delta Force. This is an early picture of the first Delta operators. Notice the modified grooming standards. They were all NCOs and a few officers, psychologically screened to make sure there were no hotheads, physical specimens that you wouldn't believe, trained to be very, very rapid firing capability. We'll talk about that later. This is the shooting house at Fort Bragg. When the Delta Force was formed, they took the prison, the brig at Fort Bragg, and converted it into the Delta compound. So there's a support staff that would change the configuration in the rooms every time the Delta Force would train to do something, so that when they burst into a room, they had no idea where the mannequins would be placed, whether the long axis was this way or that way, and that's how they established their habit patterns. The Delta Force, the 22nd SAS, GSG-9 from Germany and GIGN from France all use the same tactics to train their operators, and that tactic is self-preservation. You burst into a room, a bus, an airplane, or whatever, and you take out targets that are threat to yourself. If the little old lady is holding a Uzi machine gun and the burly guy is holding an umbrella, they put a bullet through the little old lady's eyes because she's got the machine gun. Okay? This is kind of a video about the Delta Force. They shoot better. This is one of their shooting house rooms. I have a little war story to tell you about this one. I was acting commander of JSOC in 1983, and all of a sudden I get a call from the White House that George Herbert Walker Bush, the senior Bush, Bush 41, wanted to come see what Delta does. So the Secret Service eventually arrived, had a meeting with him, and the Secret Service asked me, how can we impress Bush 41, then Vice President, as to what the Delta Force does? I said, well, the best thing you can do is put the Vice President in one of the shooting house rooms in a corner and turn the lights out, okay, and put mannequins all around him and have the Delta Force use a flashbang device on the door, burst in, and with live ammunition take out each target and leave him unharmed. Secret Service says, you want to do what? They said, well, let's see. We need to be proved this is safe. Vice President Bush is 6'2". Colonel Guidry, how tall are you? 6'2". So I actually stood in the corner up here and witnessed the Delta Force demonstration that convinced the Secret Service to do this. And the next day, it was demonstrated to the Vice President, and he was very impressed. The Delta Force is not equipped or trained to fight their way into a hostage barricade situation. They are trained to be taken to a hostage barricade situation and then take down a target. So therefore, there had to be a second force involved, and that was the Rangers. So they were the ones that would seize airfields or seize a landing zone or whatever. So they were involved as well, the Rangers from Fort Stewart. Okay, so combat controllers at that time, they're now called special tactics, were involved. Now the helicopter. What helicopter do we use? We never knew when we were going during the 5.5-month period. So therefore, to get helicopters for a mission onto a carrier was a very complicated and time-consuming process. So therefore, if the helicopters were discovered ahead of time and not blow the mission, what kind of helicopters do you use? So they decided to use minesweeping helicopters with folding blades that could be put down into the cavity of the carrier and brought up. So the RH-53D was the helicopter selected, appropriately so. The problem is getting them broken down, flying them in C-5s all the way from Norfolk to Diego Garcia with multiple air refuelings, and then rebuilding them. This shows the airplanes down in the deck of the carrier and being towed out for the morning of the mission, or the night of the mission. The question is, who flies them? This is where parochialism and Pentagon politics started to play a role. Do you try to train minesweeping helicopters that don't fly on night vision goggles, don't fly low level at night, to be instant special operators? Or do you tap the resources of the Vietnam War, where we had all these Air Force H-53 guys that could have quickly transitioned to this airplane? Well, service rivalries intervened, and option one was chosen. So therefore, the actual pilots on the mission were a combination of Marine and a few Navy guys, and rather than special ops helicopter pilots of the United States Air Force. Notice the first generation night vision goggles. I need to go backward here. Notice the first generation Air Force PVS 5 goggles. And they were told, what you have to learn how to do is fly 1,000 miles at night, low level, in the desert, 200 or 300 feet above the ground using map reading. Very daunting task for converted minesweeping guys. How do you solve the problem of fooling the Russians? In those days, we were at odds with the Russians. They used to have a trawler follow each carrier task force. So how do you solve the problem of not having the Russians tip our hand on night one and result in a trap on night two? Very ingenious plan was developed. You put the helicopters down below decks, and all of a sudden, with the trawler behind you, you increase the carrier speed to 30 knots or whatever carriers can do, and the trawlers try to keep up, and they get alarmed the first time. Then you do it 2 nights later. While you do it, of course, when you get over the horizon, you go through the drill of bringing the helicopters up and flying them. You do it again 2 nights later, then a week later, and pretty soon the trawlers get lulled in complacency and they run out of fuel. So that's how we fooled the Russians on the night one, by doing this, and the trawlers didn't catch the fact that we were launching a rescue mission. The C-130s to haul the fuel in the Delta Force came from 2 combat talent squadrons. The 8th SOS, which I commanded at the time, supplied 4 airplanes, and the 1st SOS in the Pacific Theater supplied, I said airplanes, I meant air crews. So therefore, we had 4 air crews from the 8th and 2 air crews from the 1st SOS. We had a lot of things we innovated during that time. We were in the infancy of satellite communications, and therefore we had only a few of these antennas, Doran-Mogollon antenna. So General Vaught wanted us to try to use SATCOM on this mission, but we only had a few antennas, so we solved the problem in this mission by hatch mounting them. So you could transfer the hatch from one airplane to the other, and that's where that concept came from. And that's just one example of all the tactics and procedures and equipment we innovated. How do you get fuel to the helicopters in the desert? We first tried airdropping these 450-gallon blivets. Disaster, okay? So we went to a different system. We resurrected a system from the Vietnam War where we filled the back of C-130s with 3,000-gallon bladders. Now, here was the problem. You remember I talked about the Delta Force going from 70 to 120, and that had a ripple effect. What do I mean by that? A combat Talon MC-130 has a 29-foot cargo space. You can only put one of these bladders in, but a regular C-130 has a 41-foot cargo space where you can put 2 in. So therefore, we ran out of space to bring the necessary fuel for the helicopters. So that's why we used a combination of 3 combat Talons and 3 standard C-130s that happened to be air refuelable, so that number 4, 5, and 6 could have 2 of these bladders filled with 6,000 gallons of JP4 to refuel the helicopters. These are the airplanes we used. They were ABCCCs, Airborne Battle and Command, Control and Communications from the Vietnam War. Notice we painted the bottoms black And those were the airplanes that flew number 4, 5, and 6 by aircrews from the 8th SOS. The C-141s were just being stretched at that time and given the refueling modifications. So on night 2, once we had air superiority over Iran and we had secured the airfield to be seized, then we planned to bring 2 C-141s in on minimum lights that we had set up, and those were the airplanes to take the hostages and any injured we had out. So my squadron trained 2 C-141 crews for that purpose. Gunships, we were going to use 4 on night 2. One was going to pop up at H hour. One was going to pop up over the embassy. One over the airfield to be seized. And another one would be a flying spare. And they had practiced with the Delta Force about how to coordinate fire. So we were going to use 4 on that night 2 had it come about. One over the airfield, one over the embassy. And they were using a surgical firepower that they're good at. Final plan. So after all this, guys were selected and the tactics were developed, we had a problem with night vision goggles, how to seize an airfield totally blacked out, eliminating the chance of a go-around. The first generation goggles, PVS-5s, were declared by the test and evaluation community to be too dangerous to fly with. General Vaught said, I don't care what the report says, get your guys to learn how to do blackout landings on night vision goggles. So in the period of the 5.5 months, the 2 squadrons developed and perfected the way to land blacked out on night vision goggles. And I could write a book on that iteration on its own. One of the keys was the CIA brought us this black paper that if you modify landing lights, whatever light comes out of the landing light can only be seen on goggles. We tried it different ways. We finally came up with tempered glass and put the paper between 2 layers of tempered glass and modified the landing lights. And that gave us depth perception to make a good, safe landing at the very end. So that's where the clandestine lighting came from. This is what a C-130 looks like during a blackout landing. It's surprising that if you have a long enough runway and the C-130 just brings the throttles to flight idle and uses brakes instead of reverse thrust, then they can come in very quietly. And airfield seizure. The old way to seize an airfield before this was to parachute people in. Now we perfected the method of seizing an airfield by landing blacked out a string of C-130s and Rangers. And this is what the back of the airplane looked like, full of fuel. Gross weights, 190,000 pounds plus. Okay? Okay, the finalized plan. The finalized plan was somehow we got permission, or we didn't have permission, I'm not sure to this date, to use Masira Island as a place to bring the Night 1 forces to. C-130s, 6 of them, would take off to coast in between Chabahar and Jask, just about at dark, and land the Desert 1. The helicopters would come off the Nimitz after we had everything set up, refuel, go to a hide site, Desert 2, and then on night 2, a logger site would be used to transfer the Delta to the trucks and then hit the embassy and come back to the extraction airfield. And on night 2, everybody would come from the same direction except for the C-141s would come from Dhahran. So that was the final concept after we developed some tactics that might work. This was the parking plan in Desert 1. You'll notice that 4, 5, and 6 C-130s would refuel the helicopters in this diagram. Here's the road that went through it. Here are portable lights that were set up. So 1, 2, and 3 carried the Delta and fuel, extra fuel. And EC-130s, 4, 5, and 6 carried the rest of the fuel. So that was our parking diagram. On the daytime, between night 1 and night 2, we would camouflage the helicopters so that they would avoid detection if anybody flew over. And on night 2, the plan was, of course, from the hideout, rendezvous with the trucks, hit the embassy, the helicopters are called in, land at the soccer stadium, everybody goes to the soccer stadium, and then AC-130s overhead with air power, surgical firepower, and everybody moves to the extraction airfield, abandoning the helicopters. So the Delta Force had 3 squadrons at that time. They were divided into red, white, and blue. One squadron would take care of the guards at the gate. Another squadron would take care of freeing the hostages from the chancellery. And then the third would blow a hole in the fence in line with the entry into the soccer stadium so that everybody could be evacuated and marry up with the helicopters. When you're rescuing people like that, you have no idea what physical shape they might be in. So the last thing you want is them climbing ladders or scaling fences or whatever. So the Delta Force has to handle them pretty roughly. There's this thing called the Stockholm Syndrome, where people that have been incarcerated as a hostage don't like the people that captured them, but they rely on them for food, shelter, etc. And you have to replace that authority with a new authority if you rescue them. So you may want to study that as a phenomena. So the soccer stadium, again, had this convenient entry right about here, and this is to scale what the two helicopters might have looked like coming in at night to take everybody out. This is the airfield at Mansoria. We would have seized it with two MC-130s landing simultaneously and then parking and two more C-130s coming in with Rangers, fuel, combat controllers. And then once the airfield is secured, two C-141s would have come in, parked at that location, set up lights. The helicopters would have come in, landed behind them, transferred everybody. You got to be careful because they're not used to operating in a high noise environment, these hostages, so you got to put ropes and that kind of stuff and handle them pretty roughly until you can get them in the airplane. You save the high fives for later. And then when it's all done, the C-141s leave, the Rangers shrink the perimeter down to the remaining C-130s, and you get out of Dodge with an AC-130 giving you overhead cover. Every night we had unilateral training. We had 5 full rehearsals in the United States. The rehearsals, I say full as can be. The way we do them, on a Friday night, we would fly all the way from Hurlburt and, quote, seize an airfield in southern part of California or Arizona, or seize an airfield that replicated a small airfield in Iran called Nain, and then we'd fly all the way back to replicate night 1. And on night 2, we'd do the same thing, seizing an airfield for the extraction. The airfield we used was Indian Springs to simulate the night 2 extraction airfield. If you look carefully, you'll see that the taxiway pattern is sort of similar. So we used Indian Springs to simulate Mansoria in our rehearsals. Okay, reconnaissance mission. Colonel Kyle, my boss on the mission, said, we don't want to risk losing a C-130 in the sand at Desert One. So we need a reconnaissance mission to go in ahead of time with somebody taking soil samples along the intended landing area, planting portable lights as an advance party. This was briefed to President Carter. That was a requirement. However, Cyrus Vance convinced the president to put it off until the last minute so that if that mission to reconnoiter Desert One was discovered, it would not spoil the diplomatic efforts he was undergoing. So we had to rehearse like we were going to seize a small airfield throughout, and then only at the last minute, the reconnaissance mission was conducted, and we were able to switch to landing in the desert, which is more remote. The mission was conducted by the CIA, 2 legendary pilots from the Vietnam era. One of them was named Jim Rhine, R-Y-N-E. If you want to Google his name, you'll see what kind of exploits he was under. They took in John Corney as a combat controller, and he did the reconnoiter of the possible landing site, took soil samples, came back, and planted 5 lights that could be remotely activated later. We didn't need the lights to land on, but we wanted to make sure that when we landed the first airplane, we landed where the soil samples had been taken. And as another safety precaution, the airflow of the C-130s was set up so that the lead airplane that I was on would be 1 hour ahead of the other 5. So if we got stuck, only us got stuck. Okay? Deployment. The only friend we had in the area that said, you can use my country, was Anwar Sadat. He told Carter, yes, you can come into a place called Wadi Kenya, Egypt, with the force. And we deployed by surreptitious routes, and we were successful in getting the force moved to an airfield called Wadi Kenya in a remote area in Egypt. This is what the airfield looked like. It was a true bear base. Some revetments built by the Russians during the Abdel Nasser days were there. That's where we set up shop at night to sleep. We wanted to wait until the body clocks got adjusted and NSA had time to detect whether we had moved this armada clandestinely or not. C-130 gunships, we had a problem with those. We were not smart enough in those days to make the presence of gunships known throughout the world. So therefore, how do you get the gunships from Hurlbut to Egypt undetected? You fly them nonstop, 30 hours, 4 or 5 airborne refuelings. So that's how they got there. When it was time for the forces that were going to fly night 1 to move to Masira, we used this route and ended up in Masira Island. This is what it looked like on a remote island off the coast of Oman. It was a true bear base. Now, you might think that you're flying a mission of national significance, and the United States would provide you with air-conditioned shelters, hot food, so that you're operating at your optimum. Well, guess what? We were told to go to Hurlbut Supply, pick up a tent, pick up mess kits. MREs hadn't been invented yet, so we had sea rations. This is how we lived for 4 or 5 days getting ready for the mission. Notice the guy taking a bath here. This is not an ad for American Dental Association. This is yours truly brushing his teeth the morning of the mission out of a canteen. Okay. Now, I'm from South Louisiana, the same town as Colonel Dupuy, and we knew what to do with one of these things. Portalettes hadn't been invented either, so we brought one of these to do our business. We didn't have to use a Sears catalog, though. We did bring toilet paper. This is Diego Garcia, where the tankers came out of, and the mission execution. This happens to be the crew that got zapped. We lost 5 people off this crew. They're getting their E&E kits ready. Notice the airplane has the propellers painted black, the underside painted black. They're checking out their gear. Now, before we ever left Hurlbut, I had to brief the crews that there would be no search and rescue operation if they went down. We had a very, very simple plan in case one of the airplanes went down. It was 4 words: walk east to Afghanistan. So therefore, they knew about this, and they also knew that the premier of Iran happened to have a big nose, horn-ring glasses, and a mustache. So they went to a novelty store in Fort Walton Beach before they left and picked up some E&E evasion kits, as shown here. What did we carry with us? Pointy talkies in case we went down. Now, I was also naive in thinking that, hey, I'm flying a mission that lays the prestige of the United States online, and there would be this elaborate briefing team come in from the Pentagon. Remember, there was no JSOC, there was no SOCOM, there was none of this. So I assumed there would be this high-level briefing team coming, giving a big package. Guess what? Colonel Kyle appeared with one piece of paper and says, "This is your mission." So I myself took a steno pad and made 6 copies, and this is what it looked like, and that's what the crews were handed out as far as their times, etc., for the mission. So, President sent a message: execute mission as planned, Godspeed, and we took off on the night of April 24th into infamy. This is the lead crew. Yours truly is right there. Takeoff was just about dusk. We coasted in when it was good and dark, very heavy. This is the route we flew to split the difference between Chabahar and Jask, where there was a gap in the radar. En route, we really had no problems. We were single ship. 5 followed us in this order. The aircraft commander on the lead airplane was my ops officer, Bob Brincey. And then an hour later, we had Marty Jubel flying a Talon, and then Steve Fleming flying a Talon with a diamond formation of 3 regular C-130s at 190,000 pounds, flying low-level terrain following in the mountains at night. They earned their flight pay that night. Okay, dust. I was the first one to discover that we had a reducing something that reduced our visibility, which turned out to be suspended dust. It was not a big factor for the C-130s. We had terrain following, terrain avoidance radar, INS, so it was not a big factor for us. It turned out to be a big factor for the helicopters. So we sent the signal forward, turned on the 5 lights. I could see them pretty easily. Then there was a bright light, and that turned out to be a vehicle coming down the road. So we made a couple of go-arounds, and we finally landed. Right after we landed, a bus comes by and a fuel truck comes by. The bus passengers were told to get off and cool their heels next to the runway. The fuel truck was not so cooperative. There was a pickup truck that followed it. It was a fuel smuggling operation, and that's a picture of what the bus might have looked like, and that was the fuel truck after the Rangers took care of it with a light armor weapon. The driver jumped into the pickup truck, and they headed north at point-blank speed, so it was probably a smuggling operation. The last people that would go to the gendarmes and report what they saw in the desert that night. Okay, so the tankers came in, they stretched their hoses, number 1 and number 2, to reduce the noise and the dust and all that, took off, went back home. The helicopters landed about an hour late. But anyway, here they are getting ready to launch on the mission. That's the actual launch. They flew in pairs. They had problems en route. First problem occurred to number 6. He had a BIM light, blade indicating mechanism. In those days, the H-53 blades were hollow. They were pressurized with nitrogen, so that if you lost nitrogen pressure, that might be a blade cracking, and it turned the light on in the cockpit. He got one of those lights. So number 6 was abandoned and the crew was picked up by another H-53. So now you've lost one helicopter. Radio silent, none of this was flowing. No information was flowing as to what was happening. Okay, the next thing that happened is number 5, who had lost his wingman here, was flying solo and encountered all kind of problems with his flight instruments. And everything started failing on him. So therefore, he climbed, couldn't get out of the dust, so he unilaterally decided to go back to the carrier. And the next thing that happened is number 2 helicopter lost one of the hydraulic stages. And if he lost the other stage, the controls would freeze and he would crash. So he didn't report this. None of this was reported en route. So therefore, he proceeded on to Desert 1 and reported it to his flight lead only after the fact. The abort criteria was, you got to have 7 leave the carrier and 6 leave refueled in commission from Desert 1. We were down to 5 en route but didn't know it. Okay? So here's approximately where they encountered the dust in the interior of Iran. So they started refueling. And then number 2 reported to the lead, Colonel Seifert, that he was out of commission due to hydraulics. So President Carter was told we have an abort condition. Charlie Beckwith was asked whether you can make it with less helicopters. He chose not to. So President Carter concurred with the abort. So there was still a chance to save the helicopters by refueling them, taking them back to the carrier, and hoping we had not been discovered. But in the aftermath of getting the helicopters refueled is when the accident happened. Notice Hal Lewis had given fuel to 3 of the helicopters. I'm going backwards here. Hal Lewis had given fuel to 3 of the helicopters and was Scotia on fuel himself. So therefore, number 3 helicopter was told, hey, the rest of the fuel you need to come get it off Utara's airplane. And when he lifted off, instead of going away from the C-130, kicked up a whole bunch of dust and crashed right into the C-130. So now we had a conflagration of fire and metal and rounds cooking off, and it resulted in the accident. So the abort occurred before the accident. And everybody got out of Dodge that was still alive by climbing into the remaining C-130s, and we could not wait for the wreckage to cool to take the bodies out. There were 8 fatalities on the mission. So the Iranians had to be told we were there. They took pictures the next day, and this is aerial photography after the fact. What you see here are brake applications, the light area, and this is the accident scene right here, taken after the fact. And these are the 8 that got killed, 5 Air Force guys under my command in my squadron, and 3 Marine guys. And the 3 of the 5 could not be identified, so they had to be buried in a common grave at Arlington by military law. This is the President thanking us for having tried. This is General Vaught here. General Kyle, the author of the book, The Guts to Try, is here. And there's yours truly there. Okay, Project Honey Badger, preparing for a second attempt. I don't have time to go into detail. I just want to brief you on one episode of Honey Badger. The Iranians were now smart enough to move everybody around, so they were not in one place. Okay, this is what was left behind in the helicopters, primarily maps, gear, personal effects, camouflage netting. So the Iranians captured it all and learned a lot about what we intended to do on night 2, where the warehouse was, etc. But Dick Meadows did get out safely without being detected. This is one project we came up with during Project Honey Badger. Somebody said, gee, what is the size of a C-130 compared to a 355-foot or 350-foot soccer stadium? You think we might be able to land a C-130 and take off from within the soccer stadium? So what basically happened is somebody started looking at possibilities as to whether this could be accomplished. So what they came up with Lockheed's help,
1980. In response to the 52 hostages taken in Iran, the U.S. government embarks on a top-secret mission. Codename, Credible Sport. As the situation in Iran intensifies, engineers rush to transform the 80-ton C-130 into a nimble aircraft capable of landing inside of a 350-foot Iranian soccer stadium. As it's currently designed, the C-130 needs 1,400 feet of landing space and 1,800 feet to take off. In order to shorten the distance, engineers retrofit the plane with rockets. These rockets slow the plane as it lands and provide extra propulsion upon takeoff.
You might be interested in one of the young co-pilots that was selected for training to fly this airplane. At that time, I called him Schwarty Nortz. I don't think he'd like me to call him that anymore, Norty Schwartz, our current chief of staff. They were finally released on the same time that Reagan raised his hand in January, and the hostages came home. This is the chancellery where they were held. Notice the Iranians have put up a mock statue to spite the Americans of a hostage and a stylized Statue of Liberty. Special ops buildup resulting from Desert One. This is the big benefit that occurred. General Manning was on a group called the Holloway Commission to study what needed to be done as a result of the failure, and they came up with the requirement to have a joint task force established and an advisory panel established as well. And that resulted in the formation of JSOC, the Joint Special Ops Command, that I had the pleasure of being one of the founding members of. And when JSOC was formed, an organization of current notoriety was formed at the same time to be a Tier 1 component of JSOC. That's SEAL Team 6. Everybody knows about them. And the positive results, rapid deployment of new tactics that could not have been developed that rapidly in peacetime, the formation of JSOC, Reorganization Act of 1986. So therefore, it inspired the Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reorganization Act and the Nunn-Cohen amendments, which resulted in the formation of U.S. SOCOM as a 4-star combatant command. So that was the eventual result of the spark that the Iran Rescue Mission resulted in. It resulted in the services not being able to take money from special ops anymore and divert it by coming up with this major funding program. And it eliminated a lot of the parochialism and inter-service royalties and helped us combine the forces into a joint fighting force. Okay, it resulted in new airplanes, including the Osprey. And how the mission would have been conducted then is shown here. I'm sorry, let me back up. How the mission would have been conducted then, and I have a slide that how you can conduct it now. You eliminate the ground refueling and go in on one night using Ospreys with airborne refueling en route. In conclusion, You've heard the term, the guts to try. Let me tell you where that came from. The airfield in Oman, where we operated out of, had control tower operators that were British contract workers, spoke English. And on the night of April 24th, 1980, they watched 6 C-130s leave at about dusk, and 12 hours later, 5 returned. And by that time, President Carter had come on Voice of America and BBC and announced to the world that we had tried to rescue the hostages and had failed, and there was an accident, whatever. So they somehow got 2 cases of Bass Ale, put them in a box, put them in a pickup truck, and brought them to our site and dumped the beer for us, and wrote on the cardboard flap, "To you all from us all for having the guts to try." So I tore the piece of cardboard off, put it in my pocket, flight suit pocket, brought it back, and it was framed at the 8th SOS for many years. Then the 1st SAO commandeered it and put it in their building, and now US AFSOC now has it in their building, that piece of cardboard. So if ever you're at AFSOC headquarters, you may want to take a look at that. That's where the name, the guts to try, came from. Jim Kyle, my boss, wrote the book, probably the best overall book on the mission, The Guts to Try. There have been several reprinting. There's about 30 or 40 copies left in the current reprinting. I will be selling them at the lithograph signing if you'd like to buy a copy. All proceeds go to the Special Ops Warrior Foundation. And I'll leave you with one final thought about somebody who was involved in a mission that was termed a fiasco, disaster, or failure. Words by Teddy Roosevelt. And I'll read them to you. "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by the dust and sweat, comes short, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy course, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails by daring greatly, so that his place will never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat." Thank you.
We have a presentation that the SOC leadership would like to make, so I'm going to invite Colonel Fallison to come up on the stage here.
Gentlemen, on behalf of Colonel McCaffrey, Commandant, I just want to give you one of his coins, say thank you very much for the words today. It's been outstanding to hear you speak and to provide your perspective. We are richer for it, and I thank you for your time. Let's give it up for the Air Commandos.
Hope I didn't step on you.